Chapter 1. Golden sunlight poured into the bustling Hill Street Plaza. The late afternoon brought long shadows and longer lines to the numerous cafes and restaurants that lined the area, each promising a unique and cultured experience for the discerning patron, if the reviews were to be believed. Nick suggested that they get their usual Friday dinner somewhere nicer than the rundown grocery near Judy's apartment, or the ring of fast food chains around his. And now they were crammed into a small boutique offering something called a sumo roll. Judy was no stranger to sushi, but it had only ever been an occasional treat from the cheap selection at the corner store. The $15 price tag here seemed a bit much for the next step in quality, but Nick had insisted on treating her this time. Her tail twitched with impatience as the massive line moved forward. Her usual stomping grounds were charming in their own way, but she'd never realized just how much variety in food and entertainment existed in the wealthier areas, and now she was itching to try them all. The area was host to numerous software development companies that seemed hell-bent on establishing themselves as the trendiest, most fashionably modern places to work in all of Zootopia. Mammals just a few years prior were discussing multi-million-dollar stock options or the latest killer app. Nick was unfazed, of course. He'd shown up wearing fitted jeans and a sport coat, and seemed to blend right in with the crowd of young techies and entrepreneurs. That had been a surprise, and not an unwelcome one. Until now, she'd simply resigned herself to being best friends with a terminally unfashionable fox. Judy had to admit he cut a fine figure in the well-tailored outfit. His stint in the academy had done a lot to fill out his lanky frame, something he maintained with an unexpected focus, even as an officer. Her eyes flicked downwards as an idle sweep of his tail caught on her ankle, and she traced it down its bushy length to the source. Long association and a snug fit left little of Nick's figure to the imagination, and she found herself captivated as the slow arc of his tail gently rocked his hips. You know, if you keep staring like that, people might get the wrong idea, Fluff. Busted. She felt her ears heat up. Yeah, well, I didn't think we'd be dressing up for this is all, she grumbled. That much was true, at least. She'd thrown on a simple shirt and leggings before rushing out to the metro station. Nick turned and gave her an exaggerated show of appraisal. Don't sell yourself short, Carrots. The whole starry-eyed farm girl look suits you fine. She gave him a playful nudge in the ribs. Flattery will get you nowhere, Mr. Sly Fox. He grinned. It won't? And here I got all dressed up for nothing. They stared at the menu for a moment. You always look good to me, though, Judy. Really. What? Before she could follow up on that, the harried-looking doe at the counter called them over and they rushed to place their orders. Fortunately, it was a short wait for the actual food, and a moment later, they were strolling through the plaza looking for a place to sit and enjoy the surprisingly heavy rolls. Doesn't look like there's any room here, Judy said. Nick scanned the plaza. Yeah, we might have to hoof it for a bit. Sorry. She raised the enormous roll in a mock salute. Lead the way, then, Officer Wilde. Terrace parks and walking paths wound their way through the area around Hill Street. The area's sudden transition from sleepy suburb to booming tech center resulted in plenty of cash being thrown around by the city to keep it looking fresh and modern. Outdoor gyms, picnic areas, and play structures for children were scattered liberally throughout the park paths. Nick and Judy strolled through the area, taking in the sights and munching on their rolls. Judy had to admit, it was well worth the price tag. The mix of fresh vegetables, spices, and stomach-filling rice made for a refreshingly hearty meal that was absent the graciness of Tigernese takeout or the stale blandness of supermarket salads. Nick was digging into his own meal with gusto, and from the faint pink flecks she could see, he'd gotten a seafood roll. Francine asked me out again. At this rate, I'll be out of excuses in a week. Judy snorted. I'll be sure to have paramedics on standby then, Slick. The precinct had a substantial betting pool going already, with even odds on a hospital trip or a funeral. She just likes the jokey types, you know? Remember the hyena she was going out with? Don't remind me. I still see the incident report when I close my eyes. Nick shuddered. I guess it was consensual, though. He chewed thoughtfully for a moment. What about you? I bet you've got an army of suitors chomping at the bit for some serious math sessions, huh? Judy huffed. Of course, he would never let her live down that crack about multiplying all those months ago. I'm a little busy babysitting a certain someone who's pushing his luck right now, she said with a grin, waggling her half-eaten roll under his nose for emphasis. Nick moved to snatch a bite of the roll, but Judy yanked it away from his jaws as they clicked shut. She threw him a wink and took a huge mouthful out of the roll in triumph. Rubbing his chin, Nick went back to munching his own roll. You know you love it, Carrots. They chewed in silence for a moment. I do, Nick. Something about her tone made him turn back to her again. Judy steeled herself and pressed on. I do love spending time with you, and... Ow! She was interrupted as a massive raindrop splashed on her face, and it was quickly followed by several more. All around them, mammals yelped in surprise as a torrent of water began falling from the suddenly darkened skies. Freak storms weren't unheard of due to Zootopia's extensive use of artificial climate conditioning, especially in the border areas. Usually the city's weather service would issue an alert if one was brewing, but some were simply too sudden for any warning. Hold that thought, Fluff. We gotta get to some cover, Nick shouted over the pounding rain. Unfortunately, their path had taken them almost halfway through an open park area, and by the time they made it to the nearest metro station, packed full of other disgruntled and wet mammals, they were thoroughly soaked. So much for our evening out, Nick grumbled. Sorry, Carrots. It's okay, Nick. The food was great. Judy shivered. It wasn't exactly a warm day to begin with, and the temperature was dropping even more. But can we stop at your place to dry off? She asked through chattering teeth. Nick was starting to feel the chill himself. Sure thing. It's closer anyways. A short train ride left them at Nick's doorstep, an aging but well-maintained apartment building in the Rainforest District. Nick grabbed some towels for Judy and took the shower first, shaking off as much water as possible and toweling dry the rest of the way. A fresh shirt and some sweatpants had him high and dry, although his fur was poking out all over. When he finally gave up trying to smooth it out and went back to the living room, Judy was already in the bathroom. He knocked on the door. Got everything you need in there? I don't have any fresh clothes, Nick. Can you dry mine out or something? You got it, Fluff. He was interrupted by the door snapping open and a soaked bundle of clothes landing at his feet. Judy's smiling face poked past the door. Just set it to low, okay? Thanks. With that, the door swung shut again. A moment later, the sound of the shower snapped him back to reality, and he headed down to the communal laundry room. Nick chucked the sopping wet bundle into the dryer, dropping a few coins into the slot and starting the machine. With any luck, they'd be dry by the time Judy was done showering, and he wouldn't have to leave her waiting. Naked. In his apartment. With a growl, he pulled out his phone. His train of thought was going in circles, and he could at least kill some time with some web browsing or a game. But there were several texts waiting from Judy. Was she already done? Flipping to the message app, he was greeted by a photo of Judy draped in a towel holding up one of his personal hygiene products. Musk mask? Haha, does it really get that bad? Nick rolled his eyes. Of course, After that job about multiplying earlier, she had been itching for a chance at revenge. The stuff was more for politeness anyways, so you didn't tip off every nose in the city that you were eligible at the moment. Not my fault we foxes are irresistible. Especially to elephants, right? You're never gonna let me live that down, huh? Nope. He sighed. Will you need a ride back home? It's still raining a lot. Actually, Nick, can I stay tonight? Nick? Yeah, that's fine. You can stay the night, Carrots. No worries. Great. Thanks so much, Nick. The clothes dryer buzzed loudly, and Nick nearly dropped the phone. Get a grip. She's just spending the night to avoid the rain. It was a Friday, so it's not like they had anywhere to go tomorrow morning. Besides, they usually spent their time off together, so how was this any different? Because she asked to stay, he thought. If she really wanted to go home, they could call a Zuber in minutes. Then there was that look she gave him earlier. It seemed almost hopeful? Something was nagging at his thoughts. He scrolled back to the photo. Uh-oh. Hey, Carrots. You realize there was a mirror behind you, right? What do you mean? You know, I always wondered if the white ran all the way down. OMG! Nick! Delete that pic! He howled with laughter. Maybe tonight would be interesting. Chapter 2. Judy lay silent in the large bed, staring at the darkened ceiling. A faint sliver of light penetrated the heavy blinds, tracing a thin band of visibility down from the ceiling that flickered slightly with the soft rumble of steady rainfall. She had long since given up tossing, turning, and all the other futile attempts at forcing slumber that somehow persist, despite the fact that trying to relax was a paradox itself. She couldn't sleep. It wasn't that his bed was uncomfortable. Having room to stretch and roll on all sides was a novel experience compared to the cramped quarters of Bunnyborough and her own tiny apartment. Despite his casual demeanor and sloppy appearance, Nick had a keen eye for quality and comfort, and the bedding was no different. She wondered how he could afford such nice furnishings on their meager salary. But he seemed to have a knack for acquiring things cheaply. She had to admit, it beat her crummy, worn-out mattress and rickety bed frame. Even the faint fox scent that wafted from the sheets was strangely enticing. With a huff of frustration, Judy lay still for several minutes in a last-ditch attempt at dozing off. She strained her ears for any sound that Nick might still be awake, hoping for an excuse to get up. Nothing. He must have passed out already. I'm just nervous sleeping in a new place, she thought. Just gotta get some water or something to relax. With that excuse in mind, she crawled off the bed and crept towards the door. As she expected, Nick was sprawled on the couch, sound asleep. She had to stifle a laugh at his rabbit print boxers, a joke so tasteless that only someone like him could pull off. She considered taking a picture to get back at him after her earlier attempt backfired so badly. No, that wouldn't be right, she thought. I set myself up for that one. And besides, it would be kind of creepy. Of course, her current state of standing in the dark in her underwear watching him sleep didn't sound much better. A pang of self-consciousness shot through her, and she scrambled, trying to find something that would preserve at least a shred of decency. Her clothes were lost in the dark recesses of the bedroom, and finding them would mean blundering around in the dark or risking a light. Her foot brushed against something, and she reached down to find Nick's gaudy green Hawaiian print shirt. Any port in a storm, I guess. She pulled the oversized garment on and had to quickly catch it to stop the whole thing from simply falling off her. With some kinching, it made a serviceable, if faintly ridiculous, sort of robe, and she padded over to the kitchen. Luckily, Judy had come by often enough that there was now a stepladder in the meager cooking area, and she quickly clambered up to grab a cup off the shelf. Glass in hand, she quietly filled it at the sink and tried to gather her thoughts. What did she want from all this? They'd ordered a pizza to make up for their ruined sushi, and queued up some dumb action movie on Petflix. Nothing different from their usual after-work routine. Only this time, she'd been a bit more adventurous with their seating arrangement. Judy had ducked under his arm as he brought their shared dinner around to his lap. Tucking herself into Nick's side, she leaned in tight as they sat together on the couch. Nick seemed surprised at first, but eventually relaxed and let her enjoy the moment without protest. He'd even brought his bushy tail around to drape across her lap like a pillow, and she wasted no time, running her paws through it as the evening went on. It had felt incredible. The warmth and softness as she pressed into him, the gentle pressure and resistance. She hadn't realized just how much she missed something as simple as intimate contact, and trembled slightly at the memory of it. It wasn't like she'd spent her time in Zootopia completely alone, but between the ZPD and Nick, there hadn't been much room for other relationships. Nick understood her, in some ways better than her own parents. They'd spent their entire careers working together, and had become inseparable friends. She had to come to look forward to every day with him, at each sly comment and little joke, at the support and trust between them. Their lives had become inseparable, a comfortable routine that Judy couldn't fathom ever leaving. Surely that was love, wasn't it? She'd seen plenty of married couples who got by with less, and some who could barely tolerate each other. Whatever it was, she had to be fair to Nick and let him decide on his own. With a quiet sigh, she drained her glass and snuck back across the living room. As she passed the couch, Nick stirred and rolled onto his back. She froze. You're so soft, Fluff," he mumbled. Perhaps this wasn't a one-sided issue. She crept closer to him. An expanse of plush red fur and slightly twitching ears. A bushy tail that she suddenly had a terrible urge to squeeze. And that creamy waterfall of fluff flowing across his stomach. It's not fair, she thought. Why were foxes so damn soft? For something built to kill, nature had a funny way of showing it. Judy stood paralyzed, chewing her knuckles as she tried to shake off the temptation to just dive onto him and let the cards fall where they may. She settled for brushing his belly, just once, as she ran her tiny paw through his thick fur. Nick stretched out automatically. The borrowed shirt slipped to the floor. I give up. We'll figure this out in the morning. Heart pounding and nose twitching, she carefully climbed onto the couch. As gently as she dared, Judy lay against Nick's belly. It was even better than she had imagined, feeling that warmth across her back. She couldn't resist a little shiver, and pressed harder into his soft stomach. Suddenly, his arms were around her in a reflexive hug. Judy had to bite back a whimper as she was overcome by the unexpected embrace. Flushed to the tips of her ears, Judy basked in the fuzzy glow of comfort. This close, she could hear his heartbeat, so much slower than her own. The the gentle rise and fall of his chest with each breath. A slight gurgle as the cheap pizza and pricey sushi wound its way through him. There really were no words to describe it. Once while on a trip in Tundra Town, Judy had underdressed for the harsh cold and was slowly freezing as they trudged through a blizzard. He'd picked her up and slipped her into his large jacket, zipping up the front so her head was tucked under his chin. With his hands in the front pockets, she had a comfortable seat and thoroughly enjoyed the rest of the walk. But even that moment couldn't compare to this. The wonderful pressure disappeared as Nick's arms relaxed, then fell back to the couch. Judy peeked at his face, checking for any sign of wakefulness. He was still out like a light, motionless, but for an occasional twitch of the snout or ears. She decided to press her luck, reaching out for one of his limp paws. Bringing it down to her face, she ran her small fingers over the rough pads. She briefly wondered if they were naturally coarse, or just worn out through use and age. His claws were kept carefully filed to blunted tips, but their occasional pricking was something she privately enjoyed. Judy paused for a moment, then tucked her cheek into his paw, nuzzling her sensitive nose into the padded crook of his palm. Gently placing his paw back on the couch, she rolled over onto her paws and knees. Nick was still sound asleep, a fact that would have been infuriating considering her own nervous insomnia. Some cautious crawling brought her up to his chest. This close, she was able to appreciate the sleek angles and points that formed his face, and the overall look of streamlined agility. Judy had pushed herself beyond the limits what most mammals thought rabbits were capable of, but Nick was built for speed. And maybe cuddling, considering how soft and fluffy he was otherwise. She moved a paw up to stroke his cheek, but as it closed, Nick's nose twitched and sniffed. Frozen in shock, she watched as his head turned towards the outstretched paw until his nose was nestled into it, still sniffing. A moment of stillness. Then his tongue flicked into her palm. Judy squeaked in surprise, but Nick just mumbled something into her paw, and his head fell limp again. Her eyes fell on the cream-colored ruff flowing out under his chin, and the last bit of restraint she was gripping slipped away. Working her paws under the thick fur around his neck, Judy pulled tight and dug her face into his dense coat. Nick's muzzle dipped and swayed as she squeezed onto him and worked her face under the crook of his chin. She couldn't help a soft moan as his scent filled her nose and the cushion of soft fur enveloped her, warming her whole body. The gentle sound of his steady breathing and the dull patter of rain was almost hypnotic now. Maybe this was all just a dream, Judy thought, as she drifted to sleep. Chapter 3. For Nick, dreams were usually uncomfortable at best, and nightmarish at worst. He rarely found any motivation to cling to them as hard as he was right now, trying in vain to hold on to the scraps of sensation that were rapidly fading as the sun poked through the blinds. He couldn't remember a time in his life where he'd felt so much relief and comfort. The lingering feeling of intense affection was so strong as to be almost intoxicating. The earthy, cedar scent associated with it was just a bonus, and one he might have enjoyed a little more than was appropriate. Nick wanted to lose himself in that, to let go completely, and sink back into the comfort of feeling perfectly secure and at peace. Nevertheless, the sun continued rising, and he would have to face the day eventually. Something warm and soft was draped across his chest, tucked under his chin. Must have grabbed a pillow from the bed, he thought. It felt surprisingly heavy, though, and he slowly ran a paw down its fluffy surface. Rough pads traced a path through short fur that seemed oddly familiar. The more social species could get fox fur pillows or dolls to help them sleep, but most of them were prey or microscale. A fox with one would be pushing the limits of politeness, to say the least. Finnick would never let him live it down if he found out. But when did I get one? He couldn't remember, and the strange smell that had persisted from the dream was only getting stronger. His mind was throwing out alarm bells, but he couldn't put a finger on what was causing it. Reaching further, there was a sort of fabric-covered rise. His probing claws brushed against a fuzzy protrusion poking out of a hole in the material, and he gave it a squeeze. Judy moaned softly, tightening her grip and cuddling deeper into his chest. Nick's eyes shot open as his brain finally processed what his subconscious had been screaming at him. "That's her scent, you moron!" What happened last night? Had they gotten drunk? He racked his memory, trying to find an explanation for the rabbit sprawled across him. As far as he could tell, they had just gone to bed after watching a movie and chatting. Obviously, he'd missed something important. This was going to be a delicate situation. He gave her a gentle poke. "Hey, Fluff, time to get up, okay?" Judy stirred. She stretched out fully for a moment before clenching him tight, her firm hips rocking as she squirmed against his chest and nuzzled hard into his chin. Several busy moments passed before Judy sighed and relaxed, snoring quietly. Nick couldn't stop a small whine of pleasure from slipping out. He heard that all's fair in love and war, but this was just too much. Moving carefully, he rolled Judy off him and onto the couch. As he pulled away, her eyes fluttered open, and she let out a huge yawn. "Morning, sunshine," said Nick. Good morning, Nick." She gave him a muzzy smile. He grinned. "Sleep well?" Judy sat up and stretched. "Yeah, just had to." She froze. An impressive, radiant blush crept across her face as the realization hit her. Oh my God. Her ears fell. "Oh my God. Nick, I'm so sorry. I couldn't sleep. And you were so quiet, and I didn't mean to." "Relax, Carrots. I'm not mad at you." Judy's ears sprung forward. "You're not?" He winked and held up 2 fingers in salute. "Scouts his honor." She sighed in relief. "Thanks, Nick. I guess I got a little carried away last night." "I do want to talk about that, but we should probably put some clothes on first." Judy went scarlet and immediately rushed off the couch to the bedroom. As the door slammed shut, Nick started looking for the corner his own pants had been tossed into the night before. 10 minutes later, they were sitting at Nick's cramped dining table, munching on cereal as Judy explained what happened overnight. When she'd finished, Nick chewed thoughtfully for a moment. "You know," he said conversationally, "what you did was so out of line I ought to have ZPD's mammal resources rake you over the coals for improper conduct." He fished out another spoonful of soggy flakes. "I mean, really, you didn't even try to wake me up? We could have had some real fun last night, Fluff," he said with a grin. Judy huffed. Oh yeah? If all that wasn't enough, I'd love to hear what would have gotten you up, Slick. He held up a finger. First off, I can't believe you said that out loud. Judy rolled her eyes. Second, I may have gotten a little help with that last night. What do you mean? Wordlessly, Nick got up from the table and went over to the couch. Reaching down behind it, he came up holding a bottle of cold medicine and a guilty expression. I was having some trouble myself, to be honest. Nick's look of frank embarrassment was so out of place that Judy almost forgot to reply. But why? She finally managed. Nick scratched his neck, looking anywhere but at her. I couldn't stop thinking about you, Carrots. And what I wanted to say yesterday was... He took a deep breath and looked her in the eyes. I love you, Judy. Oh, Nick. Slipping off the rickety chair, Judy crossed the room and took him into a big hug, reaching as high as she could and nuzzling into the crook of his chin. Nick hesitated a moment, then wrapped his long arms around her and pulled her in close. I take it the feeling's mutual, then? Judy's muffled affirmative rumbled into his chest. Nick ran his heavy paws down her back, gently exploring soft curves that were distantly familiar, but now achingly tantalizing. Judy made quiet sighs of pleasure as his rough pads dragged through her fur, gradually going limp in his arms. Already struggling to keep himself from falling over, Nick gripped Judy by the rear and hefted her up onto his waist. As his claws dug in, Judy let out a moan and gripped him hard, burying her twitching nose into his neck ruff. Nick fought to stay upright as her warm breath huffed into him and her scent sharpened, making his head spin with its intensity. They stood locked in the tight embrace until Judy eventually pulled away, flushed and beaming. Nick reached down to her face and plucked a tuft of his own fur free, giving her a quizzical look. You're really enjoying this, huh? Judy grinned, pulling his muzzle down so they were eye to eye. More than you can imagine, Slick, she said, throwing in a saucy wink and kiss on the snout. Nick just barely managed to keep his composure. High praise coming from a bunny, I guess. We're not all sex-crazed maniacs, you goof. Bummer. Laughing, Judy dragged him over to the couch. She hopped up and turned to him, beckoning with open arms. Nick, however, had paused at the edge of the sofa, looking conflicted. Maybe we ought to slow this down a bit, Carrots. Take a little time to get our heads clear, you know? It's been kind of a wild morning for both of us. Judy huffed in frustration, but she could see his point. Emotions were running high, and they might end up doing something crazy at this rate. Not that I'm against it, she thought privately. The feel of his claws was still fresh, and she was suddenly craving to explore all the intimate differences between them. The automatic fear of predators had mostly faded by now, but the primal thrill was still there, and seemed to only intensify her feelings. You're right, Nick. We've got the weekend off. So maybe dinner tonight, then? He grinned. It's a date. A real one this time. Promise. Great. I'll see you at 6. Right. Neither of them moved. Maybe one more hug for the road, Carrots? Sure. 5 minutes can't hurt. 10 is no biggie. 15 at most. It was going to be a busy weekend, but for now, they had a little bit of time.